So, of course, I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're discussing tips and tricks for working with imported models in Onshape. And this really drives from just the number of questions we get about working with imported geometry, all the different types of geometry we work with, what can be done with imported geometry, kind of what kind of options do you have if someone sends you a step file, an IGES file, a Parasolid, or something along those lines. So, tips and tricks for working with imported models. As always, I like to say, please ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll do my best to stop and answer the questions as we go through today's webinar. The agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to start with just discussing the import process. How do we import? What options do you have when you're importing? What kind of file formats are supported for importing? And then I want to go over tips and tricks for working with imported data. So we're going to spend some time discussing direct editing tools in Onshape, selection tools, and the things that you'll need to know to make those modifications to imported data. And as always, again, feel free to ask any question, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that come up, throughout the webinar. It's going to be a short one. We're just going to focus on the direct editing tools and the selection tools and just spend a brief amount of time just going over the import process as a whole. So let's get started. One of the common questions, the first question that gets asked when we talk about importing data into Onshape is what kind of file formats are supported. And what I'd recommend, it's too many to place in a slide, is to go to the Help menu. So in Onshape, if you go to Help, there's importing and exporting files and a list of supported file formats. And the reason I mention the Help is it's constantly up to date. So with every new release, every new format that we support, it's instantly added to the Help as part of the update process. So anything I show you here, if you're watching a recording of this from a year from now, it'd probably be out of date. So the biggest thing that I would suggest, if you're interested in, is this format supported, for import or export, is the Help. And I'll show you how to get there in just a moment. But that's the first thing that I want to address because it's the most common question that comes up. What is the list of supported file formats? And again, you can find that under the Help. In fact, let's jump into that. I'm going to jump into a document here. Help is under the question mark in the top right. In the top right here, you'll see Help. And in the bottom, you'll see importing and exporting files in the bottom left here. And in that is supported file formats. Right? Now, of course, there are different lists, right? So if I go to import formats, we have a list for part files, then a list for assembly files, and of course, drawing files. This is the most up-to-date list of supported formats. So it's important to stress, if you ask yourself a month from now, what's the list of supported formats? Does Onshape support importing X? You can come to this list and check it, right? So that's the first thing that I would stress as you're getting started is the Help, and under importing and exporting files, there's a list of supported file formats that's constantly up to date. All right, so that's the first thing to address. I know for many out there, you're probably already aware of that, but for those just getting started, that's the most common question I get, so I want to make sure to address it. Then we get into how do I import? There's two ways to import. Both are very simple, and it really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So you can import from the Create icon, from the Documents page. There's an option there to import. Or you can import from an existing document. So if you're in a document and you have, you're in there modeling, you're doing your work, and you need to import something into that document, you would go to the plus icon in the bottom left corner of that document, and there's an option to import. So again, two different ways to import. If you go to the Create icon, choose Import, it's going to create a new document named after that imported file. Right, so that's the workflow that you would take if you want to import something and create a new document out of it. But if you need to import into an existing project, for instance, you would open up that document, go to the bottom left corner, the plus icon, and choose Import. So let's just cover that. It's very, very simple, so there's not a whole lot to show here. But as I mentioned before, there are two different ways. The first is from the Documents page. You'll click Create, and then choose Import Files. Right? Now, it's important to stress you can import any kind of file that you would like. right? So, there's a long list of supported file formats. Those are just the files that will translate and be viewable inside of Onshape. But there's you can essentially import anything that you'd like. So if you just want to import and store a file within a document, you can do that too. But in this case, I have a zip file. This is a SolidWorks Pack and Go zip file that I'm importing into Onshape, right? So I hit open, I hit OK. I can choose any kind of import options that I'd like. Now, keep in mind, there are a few kind of critical import options that you may want to consider. If the imported model comes with the y-axis up, as in the case in many CAD systems, the y-axis is considered the up axis in many CAD systems, you would want to check this. Also, if you have any kind of issues with imports, there's a potential for a fault, right? Meaning some kind of bad issue with geometry. You can allow imports with faults, right? And that's an option that's now on by default. It's been there for a while, but it's now on by default. But just keep that in mind. These are a few import options that you'll want to reference. Just helps for orienting the model. And then if you have any kind of geometry issues, it will allow those to translate and still be visible. And that's the important thing. In the past, if you imported geometry with errors, it wouldn't allow it. It would just fail to import. So the last thing I want to mention about these is the import drop-down options. You should really only have to go into this if you have kind of an extraordinary circumstance, I would say, and that is rather big, very big assemblies, or something that you want to deliberately flatten, so to speak. And I'll give you an example. The option here, split assemblies and parts into multiple documents, is great if you have a very big assembly and you want to take the existing hierarchy and structure and replicate that in Onshape, because it will create the necessary parts in different documents. Very useful for, again, very large assemblies. The last one, flatten assembly, is very useful if you want to simplify something. So say, for instance, you're importing a model and it's circuit board, and you really just need the geometry. You don't need all the complicated 100 parts that come with the assembly. You just want to simplify it and then bring it into your model. Flatten is a good use for that because it simplifies the geometry down to a single part studio where you can Boolean merge everything together if you want to very easily. But flatten, very useful in that circumstance where maybe I'm trying to simplify a model before I bring it into mine. I don't care about having every single part in the assembly level. I'm not generating bill of materials or anything for this part. I really just need it in my assembly so that I can build up my part, right? So those are the import options. Very important to mention. I'm just going to choose the default, and I would say in most cases the default works just fine. I'll hit the OK, and it's going to import my geometry, right? So the first step, of course, is to import, then it translates if it can. So if your file is on that list of supported file formats, Onshape recognizes that and automatically begins the translation process. So once it's done uploading, it will translate. Once it's done translating, you can view it in Onshape, right? You'll see the progress. Now you can see it's uploading. It's uploaded successfully. Now it is translated, and actually it's finished. So now it's finished translating. So here you can see comealong.zip. That was the name of the zip file that we brought in. If I left click this, it is now viewable inside of Onshape, right? So this is the top level assembly. You'll see sub-assemblies in here as well. So it does break down that subassembly structure if you're importing an assembly like in this case. One thing I would stress is there are a few things to point out about imported models. One of the first things I would stress is when you import geometry, it comes in the orientation it was originally modeled. So in the Part Studio, all of the parts are brought together in their original orientation. So in this case, these were modeled in a bottom-up manner, right? They're modeled independent of one another. But if you had brought in an assembly that was built top-down, what you would see is they would all be built with those contextual relationships in place. But it's important to stress, one of the first things I would stress about imported geometry is it comes in the orientation it was originally modeled, right? And so all of your imported parts will appear in one part studio, and in essence, all brought together. In this case, because it was modeled, they were all modeled with respect to this origin, right, in this position. Now, one big tip that I have for you is, at first this looks a little daunting, and it can, if you have larger assemblies, look kind of scary at first to say, how do I find the part that I want and, make changes to it. One of the biggest tips that I can give you for working with this, part studio with a number of different parts in it is the hide other parts. So I can, let's say for instance, I want to make edits to the grip. I can right click on the grip itself and say hide other parts. And that will hide everything but the part that I've right clicked on. That is a particularly useful command when you're working with 60 or 70 imported parts in a part studio. You don't want to hide them individually or have to shift select or anything like that. Right click hide other is the fastest way to get to just that one part. Now we also import surfaces, right? So you can see there are 7 surfaces here. I can shift select if I want and hide those as well. But again, the key thing to stress about the import, you can do it from the documents page, and keep in mind, when you do it from the documents page, you're creating a new document, right? So it's in essence very good if this is its own document that's going to go into other places. That's the thing to consider. Question. Why can't this part studio come in correctly like it does when I import all into a part studio? The assembly will come in the correct position. All the parts are correctly oriented in the assembly. In this case, I'm importing in the assembly. But when you import and translate, it's taking all of the parts and putting them into the same position, the position they were originally modeled. So if it was built top down to begin with, and you import it, it would come in that position because that's how it's positioned with respect to its origin. But if it, in essence, if you choose to flatten and you bring everything into a part studio, it takes the assembly and then converts that to a bunch of parts that are fixed in the part studio. So important thing to keep in mind. What if the imported assembly had multiple configurations? There's not support for configurations on import. Very good question. So in that case, you would have to export each configuration and import them one at a time. Audio is distorting. I'll do my best to clear up the audio. Forgive me. Okay, so now let's get into importing into an existing document. So let's say, for instance, that I have this existing project and I have to bring in a pump or a motor or a DXF that's related to that project. In the last example, we created a new document, essentially by clicking Create and choosing Import. That creates a new document. But what if I need to import something into an already existing document? And that's where you'd go to the plus icon in the bottom left corner. So I mentioned before, there are 2 ways to import, from the Documents menu or from an existing document. You go to the bottom left corner, click plus, and choose Import, right? And then you can browse to the file that you'd like to import, hit Open. It's going to do the same thing. It's going to upload and then translate, and it will add that imported geometry, imported file, whatever it may be, to your document, right? So if I left click here, here's that DXF that we've imported. By the way, a tip regarding DXFs, if you import them initially, you'll just view them, but you can also convert them to an Onshape drawing. So if you have a need to convert existing DXFs to Onshape drawings, you can. Just right click on the tab itself and say Create Drawing Of. So those are the 2 ways that we have to import. Again, from the Documents page, you can click Create and Import, and then browse to the file you'd like to import. Or from an existing document in the bottom left corner, click the plus icon and choose Import. All right. So the next question that naturally comes up is, after I've imported my file, how do I modify imported geometry? It's a very common question. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the answer that everyone is looking for, right? So one of the biggest things to remember about imported geometry is that you do not get a feature for feature translation between CAD systems. So if I import geometry from another system, I do not get the sketches or the features that part was originally designed with, right? Same goes for assemblies and mates, right? All those things do not translate over, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. So it means that your options for modifying the geometry are essentially direct editing style tools, right? And Onshape actually has very powerful direct editing tools. There are only 4 icons in the toolbar, so they look very subtle, but they are very powerful in what they can do. And like a lot of things in Onshape, it's, as you start to dig into it, it gets, more and more in depth. So I want to spend some time going over direct editing tools, what options are available to you, and just some general tips that I have for working with imported geometry, things that I've found are very useful if you do a lot of working with imported geometry. So again, in essence, how do I modify imported geometry? Direct editing tools are the simple answer to that. Now it gets a little bit more complicated, and I'll go over that in a minute. But in short, that's what you're going to need to do. So let's jump into it. As always, again, ask questions. Please feel free to ask questions. What I'd like to do is go through just slides of each of the different direct editing tools very quickly, and then go through a few of my favorite examples of commonly asked questions and how to answer them with direct editing tools. So let's get started. The first that I'd like to cover is Move Face. Move Face, in my opinion, is the most versatile direct editing tool that we have. It solves a lot of examples that I could give you. And this is one example where, it's at first very subtle looking, but then we have 3 different types of move face within it. And in many CAD applications, those would be 3 different icons in the toolbar. In Onshape, it's one move face feature, but you can do a translate, rotate, or offset with that same command, right? So translate, rotate, and offset, and it's not just necessarily the ability to do these things, but how they interact with other, faces of the model that's particularly powerful. So move face, definitely, if I had to choose one that I would spend the time to learn if I'm doing a lot of direct editing, is move face, because it is, in my opinion, one of the most powerful. Replace face does just what the name implies. So it takes a face that you've either created with a surface, for instance, or another face of the model, and replaces the one you've selected with the one that you select. It's a very simple command, very useful in a number of different situations where you're essentially trying to remove a face, or you want to create a surface and then replace the face of an imported part with that surface. Right. That's where replace face is most valuable. Next one is probably the least considered, and that is actually just the normal extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft with profiles. So it's important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily just direct editing tools that allow you to make changes to imported geometry. You can make face selections and use the normal extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft commands. So if you just need to offset a face a bit, you can use extrude and use the remove command. Or if you need to offset up and add material, you can use the normal extrude. Select a face of your imported model, and it will work just fine. The important thing to stress is, again, it's one of the tools that almost no one thinks of when they import a model, but works really well in a number of different situations. Right. So important thing to stress, again, it's not just about the 4 direct editing tools that you see in the toolbar, but also some other features that may work as well. Right. So extrude, revolve, sweep, loft, all work just fine with face selections. Are the extrude faces new face IDs or same face ID? I'm not sure I understand the question. It is driven in the sense that if the face changes, the geometry updates, which I think answers your question, right? If I were to roll back before the extrude and alter the face, the extrude should update, right? Because it is, in essence, that same face. Is the face a new face or the same face moved? It's the same face moved. right? I believe it depends on the scenario, but in this case, for instance, the screenshot that you're seeing there, um, it would be the same face moved. Steps are typically faces only. When doing an extrude on a face, does a solid or another face? Well, it's important to keep in mind if you're importing with surfaces, right? There are many solid steps that you can import, but if you're importing with just surfaces, then you have the same rules that would apply with surface modeling geometry. Um, so if that's what you mean by typically faces only, if you're importing just surfaces, not solid geometry, then you have the same rules. Um, so when doing an extrude on a face, is it a solid or another face? I forgive me, I'm not sure I totally follow. But yeah, it is important to stress if you're importing surfaces, that's the rules of surface modeling apply, right? Can you extrude at an angle? Sure, you can add draft. That'd be one way to do it. There are a number of ways you could create a pyramid, for instance. It's definitely a cool modeling example because you could build it so many ways. But if you're just trying to extrude at an angle, a draft sounds like the thing that you're looking for. All right, so this is again, just extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft command. It's the command that not many think of when they think about working with imported geometry, but it does work, right? So if you need to, just offset faces, or you need to do a swept path, as long as you have reference faces or things to reference from the imported model, it should work just fine. And again, the key thing to stress, this was mentioned earlier, this is again specific to solid model. So surface modeling is a different thing entirely. All right, so let's get into delete. So the question comes up often, how do I delete a hole, or how do I remove a face? That's where delete face is most useful. Delete face is really applicable if you need to just delete geometry and what's referred to as heal in Onshape, essentially patch over it. So if you've imported a model and it has holes and you need to get rid of those holes for whatever reason, maybe create different holes in a different location, delete face is the tool that I'd recommend. If you, for instance, imported a model and the surface is wrong, and one of the faces or a few of the faces are wrong and need to be recreated, delete face is the tool that I would use to delete all of those faces. And then you can use our fill command or our loft command to patch those faces, so to speak, back into the geometry. But delete face, like the name implies, allows you to select faces from imported models and delete them. Right? Whether they patch the geometry or heal the geometry afterwards or not is entirely up to you. There are a number of examples that I could give you for delete face, but aside from move face, in my opinion, this is probably the second most common direct editing tool, just because of all the use cases that it fills. So delete face, definitely a very powerful direct editing tool, something that if you're doing a lot of direct editing, you're sure to use quite a bit of. The next one is something I think is very unique, and it solves a very common problem, and that is the ability to modify a fillet. So the thought here is, oftentimes you need to make radius changes to models for whatever reason. Sometimes it's tooling, sometimes it's cost, driven by tooling or some other factor, where you need to change the radius of an imported model. Change the fillet size, for instance. And that's the term that you would translate into CAD, right? The fillet needs to be a certain size, based on X, right? And oftentimes that's not decided until it's reached, a certain stage in the process where it's not so easy necessarily to go back. And it depends on who you are in your environment. But in short, oftentimes it's common to need to change the radius of a model after it's been exported. And that's where modify fillet is really useful. It essentially allows you to select a fillet, a radiused face on an imported model, and resize that fillet to a different size. Very useful, again, for things like manufacturing, if you're changing the radius for tooling or something along those lines. So modify fillet, very useful command, essentially very easy in how it works. You select a face or a series of fillet faces, and it resizes them to whatever fillet radius that you enter. All right, so the last slide that I have for you before we jump into the actual tools themselves is probably my biggest tip for you in this webinar, and that is create selection. right? So I can't stress this enough. It's very, very helpful for selecting all of the things that you're going to want to select when working with imported geometry. In my opinion, this is one of the most tedious parts of working with imported geometry is when you need to make changes. How do you select all of the faces involved with the changes that you need to make? Create selection makes that very, very easy. So I can't stress that enough. It's actually built into most every direct editing tool that you're going to see. So it's not, it's hard to miss, but it is very powerful. And I'll give you a couple examples of why I think that's the case. But it's really critical to understand. And probably, again, my biggest tip for you: use create selection. And I'll give you a couple examples of why I think it's such a big thing. All right, so let's get into a couple examples of these tools. I want to start with just simple move face and go over the different ways that we can move a face. Now, this is an imported fuel pump, right? It's coming from a different CAD system. You can see it's just import one here, one solid body, and I need to make some changes to this model. For instance, this flange where the part bolts is off by, say, 45 degrees. So this entire flange and all the holes and everything aligned with it need to rotate 45 degrees, right? That's an excellent example where move face is valuable. Remember I mentioned before, you can offset, translate, and rotate using move face, right? So again, my opinion, move face is the most valuable of the direct editing tools, the most powerful, I should say, of the direct editing tools. So you'll find move face right here in the toolbar, right about in the middle. I'll select move face. Then I need to choose my faces to move. Now this becomes the hard part. As I mentioned before, one of the most tedious parts of working with direct editing or working with imported models is selecting all the faces involved in the thing that you need to move. So if I think about what needs to happen here, I need to move all of these faces that are associated with the flange, right? So very tedious process, probably a few dozen faces involved, including the holes and the counterbores and so on. Manually selecting them would be tiresome, right? It would be a struggle. And it's very easy to miss something. So what I'd recommend is using create selection and using the automated selection tools to find the protrusions or the holes or the tangent connected faces rather than manually left clicking them one at a time. In fact, as I mentioned before, create selection is built into many of these commands. So here I can just click create selection, right? And then choose, well, what do I want to make a selection of? And you have options. You can choose protrusion, pocket, hole. And essentially what we're saying here is if I select one face of a hole, select the entire hole, right? Find all the faces associated with the hole and select it. Or if I select one face of a protrusion, select all the faces associated with that protrusion, right? Very useful if that protrusion consists of 50 or 60 faces and selecting them individually it would be very hard to do. So again, lots of valuable selection tools that I'd recommend checking out. Fillets is another one. We'll select all the fillets. Tangent connected. Probably one of the more common questions I get asked. Is it possible to click a face and have everything tangent connected to that face automatically select? Yes. And this is how you would do that, right? So in this case, I want protrusion, right? Then I just want to click on one of the faces associated with the protrusion, right? In this case, the flange that we need to rotate. It will select everything. You can see 38 faces selected. Very important tip, make sure to click Add Selection, and that will add all 38 faces to the Faces to Move selection, right? So rather than clicking, again, 38 faces, I use the Create Selection tool to grab them, right? From here, I choose what kind of move face do I want. As I mentioned before, you could do Offset, Translate, and Rotate. In this case, we want to rotate. And then choose an axis. And like any axis selection in Onshape, I can just choose any cylindrical face, circular edge. They all work as axis references. And here I can say, what's our rotation angle? Let's say 45, right? Enter, and it's going to rotate, again, the entire flange 45 degrees. It will still line up, it will still merge with the rest of the geometry, right? But it allows me to grab that entire protrusion and spin it, right? And again, that's something that without the original sketch and features that drive this can be a very tedious thing to do in many systems. But move face and Onshape, very powerful feature, something I can't recommend enough, right? I hit the green check, and now I've rotated that entire flange 45 degrees, right? So that is the move face feature and the rotate option. I can't stress that move face, is a very powerful one. In fact, let me show you another example. Let's do a translate option. So let's do this. Let's do move face, right? I'll use the create selection. Again, can't recommend this enough. Let's go to create selection. I'll grab the protrusion. Let's say I want to move this boss, right? I'll hit add selection, and then we'll grab the hole. Same thing here. Add selection. So now, if we back out just a bit here, I can grab all of these. Try that one more time. Move face, create selection. Let's grab the protrusion and the hole. Okay. Make sure to hit add selection after you're done with one selection before you move to the next one. Right? Add. Now we don't want an offset. We want a translate. Now when you define a translate, it's important to define a direction to translate along. So in this case, it has face of import 1 as a reference, but I can choose, for instance, another flat face, and it will move perpendicular to that face. So if I select this face of the flange, for instance, now I'm moving this entire fitting, right, the fitting mount at least, right, and the hole associated with it along that direction, right? And so I can just grab and drag, and it will intelligently move along that geometry, right? So I can shift this, and notice the geometry changes dramatically, right? If I look at its original position, this is nowhere near, it's much longer in terms of how far it has to extend before it meets surrounding geometry. But very powerful feature. That's just an example where translate works really well, and this is something that, again, without the original sketches or features would be very difficult to do. But translate, very powerful option within the move face, and that's what I mean by move face being, in my opinion, one of the most powerful features that you can get, right? One of the most powerful direct editing tools that we have. But now I've taken and rotated these, or I've shifted this down X amount along the axis, perpendicular with the part in general, and I've rotated the main flange 45 degrees. So, and rather easily, right? Just using simple move face, translate, rotate options. So the other move face command that's very powerful is offset. Now I want to go over jump to just real quickly a different example of this. And I think this is one that's particularly powerful because of create selection. So say, for instance, that you've imported a model and you need to change 50 holes, all and you don't want to offset them all at once. Maybe I need to delete a hole or delete a whole bunch of holes, right? Or maybe I need to offset the diameter of 50 holes by 30 thousandths, right? Or 0.1 millimeters or something along those lines. How would you go about doing that? And this is a good example of that because it's an imported model and it has a lot of holes. And it's very common for me to need to change the diameter or just get rid of them altogether. So let's go over getting rid of them altogether. The first thing I would recommend, if you're just trying to eliminate a hole, is delete face. Right? Delete face will allow you to select geometry, and it will just delete and heal the model by default. So there's an option there to heal model. Question: you selected the big hole in the middle, but not the two holes outside of it. Did the outer two holes get selected with the protrusion? Yes. This is a function of the sketch, very likely. There are no sketches in that model, but it did select the holes as part of the protrusion selection. Right? Any holes associated with that outside of, in this case, a through hole, were selected with the protrusion selection.
All right, so say for instance, I've imported a model and I just need to get rid of a few holes. There are holes in the imported model that I just don't need. Delete face and heal is the tool that I'd recommend, right? Delete face, just select the hole and it will delete the hole, right? It really is that simple. So if all you're trying to do is delete simple geometry and go back to a flat face, that's what I'd recommend doing. That again is the option, forgive me, edit, to heal, and that's by default, right? You can also cap, which will cap the top of the hole, or you can choose to leave open. Now, leave open has a whole different workflow. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. But I do want to mention, again, simple, just getting rid of geometry, delete face with the heal option is what I recommend. Right? Now, let's say that I don't need to delete a hole. I need to change the diameter of a whole bunch of holes at once. How would you recommend doing that? And I think the biggest thing here isn't so much the changing of hole diameter, it's how you select all of the holes involved. And that's another example where create selection is useful. So let's say I go to move face, right? And in this case, we want to do an offset, right? Changing the hole diameter is an offset. I'm going to choose the create selection tool, just as we did before, right? I can choose the hole option, so it will grab every face associated with the hole. And then I just select one of the holes, right? Select it here. Notice it selects all faces associated with the hole, even the counterboard face on the other side. Now, what's really powerful here is the ability to select patterns. So this is an imported model. There are no sketches, there are no features associated with it, but it will look at the geometry and say, here's all of the matches to this hole, to the selection that you've made. So if I click select pattern, it will go through and find all of the holes that match that pattern, right? And so in this case, 68 faces have been selected. That's 68 faces that I don't have to select manually, right? Just in this case, with a couple of clicks, it will find all of the patterns, it will select all the faces associated with the hole, and I can hit add selection, right? And now I'm offsetting, it's in essence, probably 30 holes, 20-something holes, with just, a couple of clicks. So here's 0.03, and if we zoom in here, now I'm offsetting all of these holes by 0.03 inches, right? So the tip here, again, use the create selection. This is another example where create selection is useful, but also the select patterns option within create selection, because in this example, it saves me from having to go through and individually hole select, right? So create selection is really great for grabbing all the faces associated with a single face, but what if you want to grab all the patterns of that geometry? That's where select patterns is useful. Right? So I hit the green check OK, and now I've offset 20-something holes with 30 thousandths of an inch, right? and relatively quickly. So that is again, really using the create selection tool and the offset move face option. Now, one of the last things I want to spend some time on here is the entire workflow surrounding working with imported models, in essence, by deleting faces and recreating them. So a lot of what I've shown you here is, offsetting existing geometry, making, diameter changes, or just eliminating holes or shifting faces around, right? I can also use move face to just grab and drag a simple face. But what happens if the geometry that I'm importing or that I'm just working with is just altogether not right? And no offsetting or translating or any of that is going to work for what I need in this model. And one good example of this is I've imported and a series of faces are just wrong, right? They have geometry that's unnecessary, or they have geometry that's failing to import, and so I'm left with that in essence a big hole in my imported model. How do I fix that? How do I go through and fix imported geometry? And that's another very important workflow when we talk about working with imported models. How do I deal with bad geometry in general, or just faces that I need to replace? Replace face is very useful if you can easily just construct a surface and say I want to replace this face with that surface. But oftentimes what you really need is to delete a series of faces and then recreate them. right? And that's where a delete face and literally using fill or loft, recreating the surfaces, is a common workflow. And it is something that's possible in Onshape. It's a question that I get asked often. In the delete face command, there's this option to leave open. And essentially what this will do is it will take your solid model and convert it to surface geometry and remove the faces that you've selected from the actual geometry, allowing you to then recreate those features with loft or fill or whatever it is that you want. Import with errors is default. Does it tell you where the errors are imported? Yes. And what we've done recently is change some of the error importing diagnostics. So you should see a difference both in the default behavior and then also the messages that go along with imported geometry. And that's, again, of course, if you have imports with errors. All right, so I've imported this geometry, and for whatever reason, I need to remove a few faces and recreate them. Maybe they're bad geometry, or they have some kind of an issue. I can go in and select the faces, and with the leave open option on, it then converts immediately to a surface. So you'll see I no longer have a solid part, I have a surface. Right, so we've gone from solid to surface via the delete face. I hit the green check OK, and now we have a hollow quote unquote model. Right, we have nothing but surface models or faces, and so now I need to recreate this geometry. Now, if I need to create a different type of geometry here, I may need to come in and construct maybe some bridging curves, or if the shape needs to be dramatically different, I may construct some sketch geometry that allows me to recreate those surfaces. But let's just say, for instance, that I've done that, right, and I'm ready now to take and bring this back into a solid model. I need to recreate the faces. Here, I'll just create a surface loft. We'll choose our selections. I'll just choose these edges here. Right, we'll create another selection for another profile on the bottom side. Right, let's go here and select two more edges. And now we'll just construct a simple loft that joins that face back together. Right? So now we've removed the problem face, we've recreated it with a loft constructed in Onshape, and now we can take it and close that, close that selection, right, or that part. In this case, part 1, right? So that's generally the workflow that you would take if you're going from a imported model that maybe has issues or just has a problem face or faces. You delete those faces and recreate those. The two most common commands that I know of in this workflow are going to be loft and fill, just given the nature of the model. But remember, extrude, revolve, sweep all work just as well. And assuming that helps you in this geometry, that may be the easiest solution. But something to consider. I know a very common workflow that I get asked questions about quite often. Can you import models and then convert them from solid to surface and then do surface modeling work and then and close it back into a solid? And the short answer is yes. Delete face with the leave open option is probably the most important tool in that workflow. And then from there, it's just constructing the surfaces or the geometry that you need to get it to the shape that you're looking for. All right, so those are the tools that I wanted to spend some time on here today. Those are the workflows that I think are most common. I do want to stick around and answer any outstanding questions that are there. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Again, using that questions section, the GoToWebinar control panel, I will make sure to stick around for a few more minutes and make sure to answer any questions that you have. One final comment I would make is if you're interested in learning more, I definitely recommend checking out the Onshape Learning Center. You can find it at learn.onshape.com. We have courses on just about everything in Onshape, from the topics today like direct editing to assemblies to part studios to drawings, branching, merging, in context, almost everything that you can think of Onshape related. There's training available for it there. Also, option is instructor-led training. So if you're interested in taking instructor-led training, that you can sign up at learn.onshape.com. And then also technical briefing. So if you're interested in papers discussing various topics, things like product structure in Onshape and tips for organization and so on, technical briefings are the best place to look. Right? All right, so I am going to stick around and answer any outstanding questions, so please bear with me. But that's what I had planned, everyone. Thank you, and have a good day.